They told JD Vance to leave, expecting him to get angry. His response left the whole diner in silence. JD Vance entered Owen's Diner in Springfield, Ohio, after a long day. The small bell above the door jingled softly as he stepped inside. The scent of coffee and grilled meat hit him immediately. He was exhausted. He just wanted a quiet meal. But the moment he set foot inside, he knew something was off. People lifted their heads. The customers sitting at the tables paused for a brief moment, their forks and coffee cups frozen in place. Their eyes locked onto JD, but it wasn't a look of recognition or welcome. Some of them avoided his gaze, quickly looking away, while others made no effort to hide their discomfort. Whispers began to spread. A few customers leaned in toward each other, murmuring in hushed voices. "Is that him?" an old man asked, holding his coffee cup just before taking a sip. The woman across from him furrowed her brows, glancing at JD out of the corner of her eye before replying in a low voice, "Yeah. After all these years, he's back." At another table, two men exchanged looks. One of them gave a slow nod. "I knew this would happen," he whispered. The other narrowed his eyes and muttered, "What does he expect?" Like he thought he'd be welcomed here. Toward the back, a woman tightened her grip on her husband's arm. The man stirred his coffee slowly, his gaze never leaving JD. "This town doesn't forget," he murmured. JD could feel the weight of the silence pressing against him. It was the kind of quiet that made someone feel like a ghost in the room, present but unwanted. The whispers weren't loud, but the words that floated through the air reached him nonetheless. They were talking about him. And not a single one of them was saying welcome back. He wasn't welcome here. Behind the counter, the hostess stood still. At first, she wore a professional smile, but as soon as her eyes met JD's, her expression changed. She wiped her hands on her apron, a nervous twitch. "Good evening," JD said calmly. The hostess hesitated, then coughed slightly before replying, "Good evening. How can I help you?" From a table near the door, a man leaned back in his chair. The wooden legs scraped against the floor. "We don't want him here," the man said, his voice firm. The hum of conversations died instantly. JD turned toward the voice. A middle-aged man with sharp eyes stared back at him. "Do you know me?" JD asked, keeping his voice even. The man tilted his head slightly. "Everybody here knows you, JD. We've seen plenty of men like you. You come around, make speeches, promise things, then leave." JD exhaled slowly. He had heard this before. "Look, I just want to eat," JD said. "I'm not here to bother anyone." The kitchen door swung open. A broad-shouldered man stepped out, walking slowly toward JD. His apron was stained with grease, the name Don stitched on the front. JD recognized him immediately, the owner of the diner. Don's gaze swept over JD from head to toe, his face unreadable. "We can't serve you here." JD narrowed his eyes. "Is there a reason for that, Don?" Don paused. "This is a small town. People don't forget things." Something stirred inside JD. "Something I forgot?" The tension in the diner thickened. This wasn't just about him eating here. There was history. JD straightened his posture. "I'm not leaving until you tell me why." A younger man at the back shifted uncomfortably in his chair. JD studied his face. Something about him seemed familiar. "Look, JD," Don said. "This place is quiet. But certain things don't just disappear. When you walk in here, you remind people of things they're trying to forget." JD's brow furrowed. "Forget what, Don?" Don let out a long breath. "You knew someone here. Do you remember?" JD's mind raced back. Springfield. His childhood. Summers spent in this town. A face. Then it clicked. "Tom." Don nodded slowly. "So you do remember." JD's stomach twisted. What had happened to Tom? From the back, the younger man stood up. "I do." JD turned toward him, eyes locking onto his face. And then he knew. "I'm Tom's brother." The diner fell into silence. The young man stepped closer, his fists clenched. His expression wasn't just angry, It was filled with grief. Tom died that summer, he said, his voice raw. And you disappeared. JD's breath caught in his throat. Tom was dead? I didn't know. Tom's brother stepped forward, eyes burning. Of course, you didn't. Because you never came back. Everyone in this town thinks you forgot about what happened. You left Springfield and never looked back. JD's pulse pounded. Was this why they didn't want him here? JD swallowed hard. What happened to Tom? Tom's brother clenched his jaw. You tell me, JD. You were with him that night. We know you went to the factory together. But why did you come back, and he didn't? JD felt lightheaded. That night. The factory. He had been there. But the memories were blurred. I don't remember, JD admitted. Tom's brother let out a cold laugh. How convenient. You don't remember, but the rest of us can't forget. JD's throat tightened. Why didn't he remember? What had happened that night? He turned to Don. You know something, don't you? Don hesitated. The tension in the diner grew heavier. We can't talk about this here, Don finally said. If you really want answers, go back to the factory. JD's heart clenched. The factory. He hadn't set foot in that place since that night. JD drove through the dark, empty streets, heading toward the old factory at the edge of town. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. He still didn't know what had happened to Tom. But he was about to find out. The factory loomed ahead, abandoned and lifeless. The rusted gate creaked as he pushed it open. Broken windows reflected the moonlight. JD took a deep breath and stepped inside. And then, the memories hit him like a tidal wave. The night Tom disappeared. He and Tom had snuck into the factory that night. Tom had been restless, searching for something. There's something here, JD, Tom had whispered. We need to find it. Then, a sound. Metal clattering. A shadow moving. They weren't alone. JD turned, just in time to see hands grab Tom. Tom screamed. JD fell backward, hitting the cold concrete. He saw Tom struggling, his hand reaching out. And then, darkness. JD staggered back, gasping. He remembered. Tom hadn't just disappeared. Someone had taken him. JD turned and ran to his car, speeding back to the diner. He burst through the door, out of breath. Everyone turned to look at him. I remember. Tom's brother jumped up. What do you remember? JD swallowed hard. That night. We weren't alone in the factory. Someone else was there. And they took Tom. Don's face paled. The entire diner seemed to freeze. JD's eyes locked onto Don's. You knew, didn't you? Don took a slow breath. Yes, I did. The diner went deathly silent. JD's chest tightened. Who was there that night, Don? Don looked away. Frank. JD's stomach dropped. Who's Frank? Don's knuckles turned white against the counter. Frank was the sheriff. A wave of murmurs swept through the diner. Some people lowered their heads. JD's pulse pounded. What does he have to do with this? Don's voice was heavy. That night, Tom saw something he wasn't supposed to see. Tom's brother took a step forward. What did he see? Don exhaled sharply. A murder. Gasps filled the diner. Some people exchanged uneasy glances. Others stared at the floor. JD's hands clenched. And Frank killed him to keep him quiet. Don nodded. Yes. Frank and his men. The weight of those words settled over the room. The town had hidden this secret for years. Tom's brother stepped back as if the breath had been knocked out of him. So that's why there was never an explanation. Don nodded. Frank was protecting this town's secrets. If Tom had gotten away in time, maybe he would still be alive. JD was filled with anger. And what about you, Don? You knew. You've kept this buried for years. Why? Don lowered his head. Because Frank wasn't alone. Some powerful people in this town had his back. If I had talked, do you know who would have been next? JD clenched his fists. This town owes Tom. Don, it's time to tell the truth. Don lifted his head. His eyes carried a deep exhaustion. They already knew, JD. But no one had the courage to say it. The diner's customers sat in silence, their eyes shifting between Don and JD. Tom's brother clenched his fists, his eyes glistening with emotion. "Where's Frank now?" he asked. Don let out a long sigh. "Dead. Years ago." "But that doesn't change the truth." Tom's brother shook his head. "These people, this town, they all knew Tom was dead. And they did nothing." Then, from the corner of the diner, an old man pushed his chair back. "We were scared too, kid." Frank wasn't alone. Another voice whispered, "If we had spoken up, maybe more people would have disappeared." Just like Tom, JD's anger burned inside him. "And what about now? Are you all still going to stay silent?" Don lowered his gaze to the floor. "It's time this town faced the truth." JD scanned the faces in the diner, his voice firm. "Tom's death will not be forgotten. No one is going to hide this secret anymore. This town will tell the truth." Tom's brother wiped his eyes. "I want justice. My brother will not be forgotten." Don gave a slow nod. "Then we all know what needs to be done." JD took a deep breath. This town had been running from the truth for years. But now, there was nowhere left to hide. JD exhaled, his gaze steady as he looked around the diner. No more whispers. No more secrets. The weight of years of silence was finally cracking. Tom's brother clenched his fists. "So what happens now?" Don glanced toward the window, where the darkened streets of Springfield stretched beyond. He took a deep breath. Now we see if this town is brave enough to face its past." A long silence followed. Then, from the back of the diner, a voice spoke, low but certain. "No more running." Another person nodded. No more silence. JD felt it. The shift. The tide turning. This town had spent years burying the truth. But the truth had a way of digging itself back up. And tonight, the past had finally come knocking.